had only 38,000 soldiers, and a lot of them are occupied in other places. So King George doesn't really have enough men to send over to really put down this rebellion. So to solve the problem of manpower, he chose to hire German mercenaries. The Patriots heavily criticized this. In fact, this is going to be one of the grievances that's listed out specifically in the Declaration of Independence. But the hiring of mercenaries had a long tradition in Europe, going way, way back, at least to the Middle Ages and probably even earlier. I'm not an expert on ancient history, but...
Oh, yeah, like half of Machiavelli's The Prince is about mercenaries.
Yeah. So it's not like King George he just came up with this new horrible thing. He was just doing what was standard part of the business at the time. If you don't have enough guys, you hire some more. The mercenaries came from all over the German lands. And of course, most of our listeners will know that there was no united Germany at this time. Germany was divided into a large number of small principalities and duchies and dukedoms, or I don't know if dukedom is the right word, but just little states. But the most famous mercenary producing state at the time was Hesse-Kassel. And because most of the mercenaries that were hired by King George III and sent over to North America came from this area, they were called Hessians, and not just them, but all of the mercenaries. So even you might have had somebody, let's say, from Bavaria or Prussia, they would still be called a Hessian. These guys we'll talk about them in more detail later when we talk about the Battle of Trenton, but these guys, I'll just say for now, were professional, tough soldiers. These were scary kind of people. These are like the New England Patriots of of soldiers. They were fearsome and had a fearsome reputation. By the end of the war, about 18,000 Hessians would serve with the British. They didn't send 18,000 at first, but by the time it was over, that's about how many came over. Another thing the British did was they didn't really think General Gage, we've talked about Gage a few times, they didn't think he was doing a good job. So Gage gets a pink slip. He gets recalled to London. He's replaced with one of the three generals that was sent over earlier in 1775, and that would be William Howe. So Howe is going to be a very important figure for the next several years. So let's give him a little bit of a mini biography here. William Howe. General Howe joined the army in 1746. He saw extensive service in the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. He became known for his role in the capture of Quebec, which we're going to talk about another attempted capture of Quebec. But just for now, suffice it to say that during the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, at least in Europe, the British attacked Quebec, which at that time was held by the French, and Howe led a daring attack. He led a force to capture the cliffs at Anse-à-Foulon. I don't know if I said that right, but anyway, they scaled up this very steep cliff, and they allowed General James Wolfe, the commander at the time, to land his army and engage the French in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. So Howe also participated in the campaigns to take Louisburg, Belle Isle, and Havana, Cuba. So very distinguished career, lots of military experience. He was the hero of Bunker Hill. We saw that he was the person in field command of the British forces at Bunker Hill, and he bravely led them personally in 3 charges, the third of which, of course, succeeded. And he was also the youngest of 3 military brothers. The oldest, George, had been killed in the French and Indian War, and the second, Richard Howe, was the commander of the British fleet in North America. So that's kind of cool, Scott. For a while, at least, the British have 2 brothers, one in command of the Army and one in command of the Navy. The oldest brother, who was killed in the French and Indian War, when he was killed, the grateful Massachusetts Assembly at the time paid for a monument to him to be placed in Westminster Abbey. And because of this really nice gesture on the part of the Massachusetts Assembly. Remember, this is long before the Troubles started. But because of their generosity, Richard and William Howe looked very fondly upon the American colonists. So we have to remember, for William Howe, putting down this rebellion was his job, but it wasn't something he just really had a visceral attachment to. It's not like, I hate Americans, so I'm going to crush this rebellion. No, he liked Americans.
I'd like to think that before he ordered the troops to fire, he would mutter under his breath, "No hard feelings, gentlemen." Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. So, think about it that way.
Or maybe he said, it's not personal, it's business.
What's that from?
That is from The Godfather, I think.
Oh, okay.
You hear that quoted all the time.
Yeah,
it's not personal, it's business.
It's one of those movies, there's so many quotes that there's a few to slip through the cracks.
Yeah, it's hard to remember them all. I haven't seen The Godfather in probably 20 years or more, but anyway, so there we go. That leads us up to the attempt to take Quebec. So shall we dive right into that? Okay, let's do it. Now, when I use the term Canada, today we think of a gigantic country north of the United States with a lot of provinces. But at the time, Canada was one big mass. It wasn't divided into provinces. Part of it was what is today Ontario, and part of it was the province of Quebec. The province of Quebec was Lower Canada, and the province of although I don't even think they had divided at this point. I'm getting my two wars mixed up. I did some reading on 1812 recently, so I think at this time it's just one big province. So Canada, think a big province. And again, it had belonged to France, but after the French and Indian War, when the British, of course, won the war, defeated the French, and at the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France gave up Canada to Britain.
Yeah, one thing I just want to mention to give a little context, in order for this campaign to make sense, because this episode is called the Quebec Campaign. So we're going to get into Canada, and we may wonder, why on earth would there be a campaign into Canada when it seems very far away from the theaters of battle? And it doesn't really make sense. There's different reasons. As James mentioned, it's not as far-flung as we would think of it being. But another reason is that some of the strategy is to exploit political fault lines between Britain and France and other places that still exist after the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War is really only a tiny offshoot of the global 7 Years' War. I mean, this is a massive war that involves every European great power. It's almost a proto-world war that there's fighting in Europe, the Americas, West Africa, South Asia, the Philippines. The French Indian is a theater of battle, this giant global war, and this is what put Britain in its bankrupt position. So there were basically two coalitions. One was led by Great Britain and includes Prussia, Portugal, and other small German states. And the other is led by France and includes the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Empire, Spain, the Swedish Empire. This is almost like a dry run for the Revolutionary War. And when we think of alliances that are going to happen later in the Revolutionary War, the foreign help that America receives, part of it is in context of this. And as we look at this Patriot campaign into Canada, they're trying to exploit some of the tensions left over afterwards. Kind of like after World War I and World War II, there's simmering tension between Germany and other Europeans after World War I that can explain World War II. These simmering tensions between Britain and France and others after the 7 Years' War can explain what's going to happen next. So that's all my little piece right there.
All right, very good. So Canada had been generally peaceful and stable under the governorship of Sir Guy Carleton. Guy Carleton was appointed as the Governor General of Canada in 1768, and he's going to actually hold that position all through the American Revolution and well and after it. It'll last until 1788, so 20 years. The Americans really wanted the Canadians to join in the revolution. But as we've seen, why would you do that if you have a good governor, if you have a stable government? So in May of 1775, when the Continental Congress issued a call to the residents of Canada to join the revolution, they declined. I said, no, we'll sit this one out. We're good. Thank you very much. Thanks, but no thanks. And at the same time as this, Congress appointed Philip Schuyler, and this is the father of the famous Schuyler sisters from the Hamilton musical, which there will be many references. That should probably be my drinking thing, Scott.
Hamilton?
Yeah, anytime, listener, that I bring up if I give a reference to the Hamilton musical, there's your cue to take a drink, okay? And again, please don't do this if you're driving, but if you're at home, there you go. The Schuyler sisters, my first Hamilton reference. It will not be the last. But anyway, Philip Schuyler is appointed commander of the Northern Department, and Congress said, plan an invasion of Canada. So he says, okay, I'll plan it. But he said, my health is not really all that great, so I'm not going to go on this thing that I'm planning. I'm not going to go on this invasion. How about I delegate it to somebody else? So he delegates it to General Richard Montgomery. So Montgomery steps off in August of 1775. He takes 1,200 men and several boats, and he marches up Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River. And again, you're going to need a map probably for this one. It would be very helpful. I can't even do the mental map thing right now. Just think of a north-south river with the lake kind of in the middle of it, more or less.
Just Google Canada, people. Come on, work with us here, people.
Yeah, I can't always do your work for you, folks. Come on. Just Google the 1775 Quebec Attack. If you just Google Quebec Attack, you're probably going to get the French and Indian War one, which is the wrong one. We talked about that earlier, but now we're talking about the Revolutionary War one. Okay, so he marches up Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River to Fort St. John, which is just across the St. Lawrence River from Quebec. So he's still in what is going to be called the United States. It's going to become part of the United States, but he's not in Canada. He launches 2 assaults on the fort, but neither works. And then he laid siege to the fort. Finally, by November, 3 months later, the fort surrenders to Montgomery. Half of the entire British regular army of Canada now had become his prisoners, and the road to Montreal was clear. So we see here a really good start to this attack, this march toward Canada, toward Quebec. Montgomery, good job, Montgomery. Took prisoners, took a fort, and now he's ready to hop across the river and land in Canada. But it gets more complicated. It gets even more interesting because just as we saw that there were 2 leaders of the attack on Fort Ticonderoga a while back, Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, now we see that there's going to be 2 attacks on Canada. And one of them is going to be led by that very same man we just mentioned. Ladies and gentlemen, present to you once again, Benedict Arnold.
If you have sympathies for Benedict Arnold, this is for you, dear listener. If you're any pro Benedict Arnold people out there, this episode is for you.
I think I saw about 3 hands go up, Scott. So that's not very many, but hey, you're going to love this part. So, and by the way, the rest of you, if you hate Benedict Arnold, try to put that on the shelf for now. Okay. Try to pretend you don't know what he does later. Because
it will make his fall from grace that much sweeter. So you can enjoy it in that way.
Yeah, Arnold's going to do a lot of good before he does his bad. Let's just put it that way. So we've already seen, number one, Arnold, as I touched upon a minute ago, Arnold was the co-leader of the successful attack on Fort Ticonderoga, which led to a lot of supplies for the Continentals. Now, Arnold is the kind of man that is restless. Arnold is a man that doesn't want to just sit around. He's not an office jockey. He can't ride a desk. He's got to be out doing things, leading attacks, marching in the field. So that's exactly what he wants to do. In mid-June of 1775, Arnold proposed a plan to Congress in which he would rally the habitants, and that's about as good a French as I could ever do.
I always have to use forvo.com with anything French. It's a pronunciation website. Yeah. Otherwise, it's hopeless.
The habitants, it's spelled like, it looks in English like habitants, but they're inhabitants, basically. These are French speakers. French-speaking people who lived in Canada. They had come over, their ancestors had come over when France ruled it. When Britain took over Canada, a lot of the French people stayed. So they're French people living under British rule. And some of them were not happy being under British rule. So Arnold was hoping he could stir up these people, tell them, hey, you don't have to live under British rule. Why don't you live under American rule? We'll be so much nicer too. Well, even the British actually gave him a lot of freedom. But anyway, he was hoping to stir them up against the British, and he was hoping to take control of Montreal, which is another major fortified city, and then Quebec. Congress approved the plan, and also George Washington gave his blessing to this plan. And Arnold paid for this